On Sunday, April 14th, 1935, the southern Great Plains began the day beneath a sky that offered little warning of what was coming. By then, families across western Kansas, eastern Colorado, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, and neighboring country had already learned that dust could enter almost anywhere. They swept it from floors, shook it from blankets, wiped it from dishes, and sometimes found another thin coating before the work was finished. Storms had become familiar enough to change routines. Windows were watched, laundry was brought inside quickly, drivers learned to read the horizon. Yet what appeared that afternoon was different in scale and terror. A dark line formed in the distance and thickened as it approached. At first, it might have been mistaken for rain, but it did not descend from the clouds. It rose from the land. Wind drove an immense wall of soil across the plains, swallowing roads, buildings, fields, and daylight. People hurried indoors. Motorists slowed or stopped because familiar routes vanished within minutes. Livestock turned from the wind. Families closed doors and windows knowing that neither could completely protect them. Fine particles worked through cracks in frames, beneath doors, around roofs, and into rooms where lamps had to be lit while the sun was still above the horizon. Dust settled on beds, clothing, food, furniture, and skin. It entered mouths and noses. The ground that had supported farms was now suspended in the air. The storm, later remembered as Black Sunday, did not create the Dust Bowl. It revealed, with frightening clarity, what years of drought, economic pressure, and land use had already done. To understand why some of America's most productive agricultural country could rise into the sky, the story has to move backward to a time when the Great Plains seemed not ruined but full of promise. Before tractors broke enormous stretches of sod, the plains had been shaped by a climate defined by extremes. Rainfall varied sharply from year to year. Strong winds were ordinary. Dry periods returned again and again. Yet native grasslands had adapted to those conditions over centuries. Their root systems reached through the soil, binding it even when the surface dried. Grasses could suffer during drought and return when moisture improved. The landscape was not empty land waiting to be completed. It was an ecological system built to survive instability. To many settlers arriving during the 19th and early 20th centuries, however, the same country represented opportunity. Federal land policies encouraged settlement. Railroads connected isolated communities to national markets. New towns appeared around grain elevators, stores, depots, and banks. Families came looking for independence and property they hoped to pass to their children. Farming was hard, but successful harvests made the plains appear capable of supporting ever greater cultivation. Then the First World War strengthened the incentive to plant more wheat. European agriculture had been disrupted. Demand for American grain increased, and higher prices rewarded expansion. Land that had supported prairie grasses or grazing was broken for crops. Farmers invested in equipment and planted additional acreage because the market gave them a reason to do so. When favorable weather followed, the decision seemed justified. After the war, agricultural prices weakened, but the transformation of the landscape did not simply reverse. Mechanization was accelerating. Tractors and increasingly powerful implements allowed fewer people to work far more ground than earlier generations could manage with horses. A farmer who once needed considerable time and labor to break new acreage could now expand much faster. The machine itself was not the enemy. It made farming more efficient, reduced physical labor, and offered families a chance to increase production. But it also changed the scale at which the natural surface of the plains could be transformed. During the wetter years of the 1920s, the risk remained difficult to see. Wheat grew, harvests arrived, towns depended on agricultural income, new equipment promised greater productivity. A successful season encouraged another round of planting, another purchase, another loan, another field open to cultivation. Prairie grass increasingly became something measured against what could be earned if it were removed. Beneath the optimism, however, an important protection was disappearing. Native vegetation did far more than occupy ground. Its dense root systems helped resist erosion. Once the grass was plowed under, the exposed surface became more dependent on moisture, crop cover, and careful management. In good years, those conditions could hide the danger. A field covered with growing wheat did not look fragile. Deep soil and broad horizons suggested abundance. The assumption that good production could continue seemed reasonable when several favorable seasons followed one another. Farmers were not conspiring against the land. Most were making decisions shaped by the knowledge, technologies, debts, opportunities, and expectations available to them. Many believed they were improving the country and securing their families' futures. Yet the system developing across the plains relied increasingly on weather remaining cooperative. By the end of the 1920s, another vulnerability had emerged. Rural prosperity was less secure than appearances suggested. American farmers had struggled with falling crop prices after wartime demand receded. Some carried mortgages or equipment debt acquired during years when future income had looked more certain. Banks and agricultural businesses depended on continued production. A poor harvest could now affect not only one household, but an entire local economy. Then, in October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression did not begin the environmental crisis on the plains, but it weakened families just before nature imposed a far harsher test. In 1930, drought began tightening its grip over important parts of the region. Rainfall diminished. Heat pulled moisture from exposed ground. Crops failed to grow thick enough to protect the surface, and in some places they failed almost entirely. At first, farmers had no reason to assume the dry weather marked the opening stage of a catastrophe that would define the decade. Drought was familiar on the plains. Families had survived difficult years before. Many planted again because planting was what farmers did, and because waiting for recovery offered more hope than abandoning land they had spent years building. But the country facing this drought was no longer the same country that native grasses had once protected. Broad fields lay open to wind. As the surface dried, loose particles began moving. At first, soil might skim close to the ground, appearing as little more than blowing dirt. Stronger winds lifted finer material higher. Grains struck the surface and loosened more particles, allowing erosion to spread across fields that had already lost their vegetation. What looked like one unsuccessful season was becoming a physical change in the land itself. Families watched fence lines collect soil. Farmers found seed exposed or buried. Machinery filled with grit. The most valuable part of a farm, the thin, productive layer from which future crops depended, was beginning to move beyond the property where it had formed. There was no dramatic announcement that the old agricultural order had ended. There was only another dry day, another failed field, another rise in wind, and a growing realization that the ground beneath the Great Plains was becoming harder to keep in place. As the early 1930s unfolded, the loss accelerated. Wind crossed thousands of acres of dry, cultivated country with little vegetation to interrupt it, carrying soil from one farm onto another, across roads, into towns, and eventually far beyond the region. Dirt accumulated against buildings and fences in drifts that resembled snowbanks but carried a very different meaning. Snow melted and returned water to the ground. These drifts represented earth that had been stripped from somewhere else. After a storm, a farmer could walk outside and find the shape of a familiar field altered. Fence posts stood shorter because soil had piled around them. Other areas had been scoured almost bare. Young crops could be damaged by abrasive particles moving close to the surface. Barns and machinery required constant cleaning. Grit shortened the life of mechanical parts. Animals struggled when forage disappeared or dust filled the air. The effects did not stop at the farmhouse door. Families sealed windows as tightly as they could, hung damp cloths near openings, and covered food, yet the finest material continued to enter. It settled into cupboards and bedding, onto dishes and tables, inside clothing and around children's faces. A room cleaned in the morning might need to be cleaned again before night. Meals required protection from particles that seemed capable of finding every uncovered surface. During severe storms, people covered their mouths and noses and tried to keep children inside, but indoor air could still become thick enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Repeated exposure irritated eyes and lungs, and serious respiratory illness added another source of fear. The phrase dust pneumonia entered the vocabulary of a region where the atmosphere itself could become hazardous. What exhausted families was not only the great storms that later appeared in photographs, it was the accumulation of small humiliations and burdens between them. Another floor to sweep, another meal contaminated, another animal weakened, another repair needed, another field that had lost part of its surface. Children could no longer assume that school, play, or travel would proceed normally when the wind rose. Adults who remembered good harvests now measured success by whether anything could still be grown at all. Meanwhile, the economy tightened around them. A mortgage did not become smaller because rainfall failed. An equipment loan remained due after a crop withered. Property taxes continued. Seed cost money. Livestock needed feed even when pastures deteriorated. Families, who had borrowed during more optimistic years, now faced obligations built on an income that could no longer be trusted. Agricultural prices remained weak, and the broader depression reduced demand and opportunity throughout rural America. One failed season might be survived with savings or additional credit. A second could require selling cattle, machinery, or household possessions. After several poor years, choices narrowed severely. Environmental damage and financial collapse became increasingly difficult to separate. A farmer could have land but no profitable harvest, equipment but no money for fuel or repairs, experience but no power over rainfall. The same economic pressure that demanded immediate production could also make conservation harder. A household desperate for income might feel compelled to plant as much acreage as possible, even when long-term soil protection required leaving vulnerable ground covered or changing familiar practices. Decisions were rarely made in ideal conditions. They were made while bank notices arrived, children needed food, and the next season remained uncertain. By 1934, drought had expanded across enormous portions of the United States, with the plains suffering especially severe conditions. Heat intensified evaporation. Vegetation weakened further. Fields that had already lost several crops became increasingly exposed. That spring, a vast dust storm carried plain soil across much of the country and toward the east coast. The crisis was no longer visible only to people living beside the damaged fields. Dirt from the interior traveled far enough to reach cities whose residents had never seen the farms from which it came. The event demonstrated something conservationists had been warning about. Erosion could become a national problem. Soil was crossing the map. For those living near the source, every storm raised the same brutal question. How long could a farm remain a farm when its productive layer was literally leaving? Topsoil was not easily replaced. It contained organic matter and physical structure accumulated over long periods. A broken tractor could eventually be repaired. A barn could be rebuilt. A lost harvest might be followed by a better one. Soil removed by wind was different. When the surface layer disappeared, future production could remain impaired even after rain returned. The damage, therefore, reached forward in time. Government officials were already trying to address different parts of the rural emergency. New Deal programs offered relief, agricultural assistance, employment, and experiments in conservation. Scientists studied erosion. Demonstration projects tested methods intended to keep more soil in place. But no federal agency could force clouds to produce rain, and no single policy could erase debt, restore crop prices, repair damaged land, and provide immediate income to every family. Many people remained on their farms because departure was no simple alternative. Leaving required transportation, fuel, money, and somewhere to go. Land represented more than an economic asset. It could hold family history, identity, independence, and the expectation that children would inherit what their parents had built. Some households endured because they believed the next year might improve. Others stayed because no other choice seemed realistic. Communities adapted as best they could. Families searched for temporary work. Neighbors shared information and sometimes resources. Local stores extended credit when possible. Banks struggled with loans that could not easily be repaid. Grain elevators handled less grain. Equipment dealers lost customers. Each failed farm weakened the businesses around it. The Dust Bowl was spreading through the social fabric of the plains, even when no storm was blowing. By early 1935, years of drought had changed the psychology of the region. Families watched the horizon because weather could turn an ordinary afternoon into an emergency. Wind beginning as a mild inconvenience might strengthen rapidly over exposed country. A faint haze could thicken until landmarks disappeared. Drivers learned that continuing into a dense storm could be dangerous because the road itself might vanish. Parents knew another evening could be spent cleaning soil from rooms they had cleaned the day before. Hope became cautious because each small improvement competed with memories of previous failure. A brief rain might darken the surface without penetrating deeply enough to change conditions. A promising crop might be damaged before harvest. The plains had entered a pattern in which recovery repeatedly seemed possible, and then withdrew. During these same years, one federal soil scientist was becoming increasingly determined to convince the country that erosion had to be treated as more than a local inconvenience. Hugh Hammond Bennett had spent much of his career examining American soils and warning that careless land use could destroy agricultural productivity. He argued that erosion was removing a resource essential to the nation's future. In 1933, he became involved in directing federal soil erosion work and demonstration projects, began showing farmers how alternative practices could reduce damage. Bennett's message was straightforward but politically difficult. Preventing erosion required money, coordination, technical knowledge, and changes in habits at a time when farmers were struggling simply to survive. In March 1935, as Congress considered stronger soil conservation legislation, dust from the Great Plains traveled east and became visible over Washington. Later generations would embellish the episode into an almost theatrical story, but the underlying fact was powerful enough without invention. Soil from the devastated interior had reached the capital while lawmakers were debating whether its loss deserved national action. The argument was no longer only in Bennett's testimony, it was appearing in the air. Then April arrived. On Sunday the 14th, families across the southern plains began another day after years of failed crops, debt, blowing soil, and uncertainty. Some attended church, others visited neighbors or tended animals. In several places, the morning offered nothing extraordinary enough to suggest that it would become one of the most remembered days in American environmental history. Farther north, however, colder air was moving south behind a strong front. Winds were strengthening across vast areas of dry ground. The landscape contained everything needed for a storm of exceptional scale. By afternoon, a dark boundary began forming on the horizon. The boundary moved with a speed that made hesitation dangerous. What first appeared as a distant black line thickened into an advancing wall, fed continuously by soil lifted from the ground ahead of it. In Dodge City, Kansas, observers recorded the arrival of an immense dust cloud at 2:49 in the afternoon, hundreds of feet high and driven forward by powerful winds. Across the southern plains, communities experienced variations of the same transformation. Light disappeared. Visibility collapsed. Roads became indistinguishable from fields. People caught outdoors hurried toward whatever shelter they could reach. Drivers stopped rather than risk continuing into darkness without knowing where the road ended. Livestock turned away from the wind. Birds flew ahead of the approaching front. Inside houses, families waited as dust pressed against doors and windows and forced its way through spaces that ordinary weather never exposed. Lamps burned in the middle of the afternoon. Children stayed close to adults. Every breath carried the taste and texture of the land outside. Black Sunday was frightening, not simply because the storm was large. People on the plains had already lived through severe dust events. What made this day unforgettable was the speed with which a familiar landscape ceased to function. Direction, distance, daylight, and even the boundary between outdoors and indoors seemed to disappear together. A farmhouse might stand only a short distance away and become invisible. A person separated from shelter could become disoriented within moments. The air contained so much soil that the distinction between sky and ground seemed temporarily erased. When the front finally moved onward, it left behind another layer of work. Dust-coated furniture, clothing, streets, vehicles, barns, dishes, and animals. Drifts had formed wherever structures interrupted the wind. Yet something had changed beyond the need for another cleaning. The storm gave the catastrophe an image that newspapers and the public could understand instantly. The expression Dust Bowl, already appearing in reporting around this period, became inseparable from a region where the ground itself seemed capable of rising into darkness. The phrase was simple. The reality was not. The disaster crossed state lines and involved climate, economics, agricultural practices, migration, public health, and politics. But Black Sunday concentrated all of those forces into one unforgettable afternoon. In Washington, the case for national soil conservation was already advancing. Bennett had spent years warning that erosion threatened the long-term productivity of American agriculture, and the crisis now provided undeniable evidence. The fundamental question was not how to prevent wind from crossing the Great Plains. Wind belonged to the landscape, nor could the federal government legislate an end to drought. The problem was how to reduce the amount of vulnerable soil available for wind to carry. That required changes in farming methods and, just as importantly, a change in how Americans thought about land. For generations, progress on the plains had often been measured through expansion. More acres broken, more wheat planted, more machinery purchased, more grain shipped to market. Conservation required another measurement: how much fertile ground remained after production. On April 27, 1935, less than 2 weeks after Black Sunday, the Soil Conservation Act became law. It established the Soil Conservation Service within the Department of Agriculture and gave the federal government a permanent institution devoted to combating erosion. Bennett soon became its first chief. The new agency could not repair the Dust Bowl by decree, but its creation marked an important shift. Soil was increasingly treated as a national resource whose destruction could affect more than the owner of a particular farm. Federal specialists worked with farmers to test and promote methods that reduced exposure. Bennett soon became its first chief. The new agency could not repair the Dust Bowl by decree, but its creation marked an important shift. Soil was increasingly treated as a national resource whose destruction could affect more than the owner of a particular farm. Federal specialists worked with farmers to test and promote methods that reduced exposure. Contour farming followed the shape of the land, rather than cutting across it without regard to slope. Strip cropping alternated vegetation in ways that broke long stretches of vulnerable surface. Crop rotation could keep roots in the ground and improve soil structure. Residue left after harvest offered protection against direct wind. In especially exposed country, shelter belts of trees could slow air movement near fields. These techniques were not dramatic. They did not produce the spectacle of a machine battling a black cloud. Their purpose was to make the next storm less destructive before it arrived. The challenge was that conservation operated on a longer time scale than household survival. A farmer facing foreclosure needed income now. Protecting land for future seasons could be difficult when the bank expected payment this month. Families who understood the value of conservation might still lack the money or labor to implement every recommendation. Federal programs, therefore, became intertwined with the wider New Deal response to rural poverty. Relief, agricultural assistance, credit programs, public employment, and conservation projects addressed different pieces of the crisis. Government workers entered communities where federal involvement had previously been limited. Demonstration farms showed how new practices performed under local conditions. Specialists measured erosion and advised landowners. Tree planting programs attempted to create windbreaks on a scale no individual farmer could manage alone. Acceptance varied. Some farmers welcomed help because they had watched enough soil disappear to understand that older habits could not continue unchanged. Others distrusted officials, or worried that recommended methods would reduce the acreage available for immediate production. Scientists themselves were still learning how different soils and climates responded. Recovery would be gradual even under ideal conditions, and the conditions were far from ideal. Drought persisted through much of the decade. Rain remained unpredictable. Conservation could reduce vulnerability, but it could not guarantee a crop. That distinction mattered to families already close to losing everything. Black Sunday had helped turn the Dust Bowl into a national emergency, yet national attention could not restore a household's savings or erase years of unpaid debt. For some, federal assistance created enough room to remain. For others, the decision to leave had already become unavoidable. Departure was rarely the dramatic abandonment later photographs might suggest. It was usually a practical calculation made after alternatives had disappeared one by one. A family might first sell livestock, then machinery, then household goods. Relatives could provide temporary help. Another planting might fail. A bank notice might arrive. Eventually, the question changed from whether the farm could recover to whether the family could survive long enough to see that recovery. Stories of agricultural work in California circulated through communities where local opportunity had collapsed. Handbills, newspaper reports, letters, and word of mouth suggested that growers in the West needed labor. California seemed distant but possible. Its orchards and fields appeared to offer what the plains no longer could, work tied to crops that were still growing. The reality would prove far more complicated, but desperation has always given rumors of opportunity unusual power. Families looked at vehicles already worn from years of use and calculated whether they could make the journey. They considered gasoline, food, spare tires, and the possibility of breakdowns in unfamiliar country. They decided what could be taken and what had to remain behind. A mattress might be tied to a roof. Cooking pots, blankets, clothing, tools, and boxes were packed wherever space existed. Everything a household still possessed could become visible on the outside of a car or truck. For parents, leaving meant surrendering the expectation that their children would grow up on the same ground. For children, it meant watching a familiar world disappear through a rear window. The Dust Bowl had begun with the movement of soil. Now it was beginning to move people. The road west turned private loss into a migration visible across the American landscape. Among the routes used by families leaving Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, and surrounding areas, U.S. Highway 66 became the most enduring symbol. Running southwest through the interior toward California, it offered a practical corridor between places where rural opportunity had collapsed and a state advertised as a land of agricultural employment. The highway did not carry only farmers escaping the worst dust storms. The migration was broader than the Dust Bowl's most damaged counties. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, laborers, and families displaced by mechanization or falling agricultural income joined those whose fields had been destroyed by drought and erosion. Their reasons overlapped: foreclosure, unemployment, debt, failed crops, declining wages, and the simple absence of a viable future where they lived. The journey itself demanded resources many families barely possessed. Vehicles were often old, tires wore quickly, engines overheated. Gasoline represented a serious expense when savings had nearly disappeared. A mechanical failure that would have been inconvenient during prosperous years could become disastrous beside a desert road. Families slept in their cars, beside highways, in inexpensive camps, or wherever temporary shelter could be found. Meals were simple because every dollar spent before California reduced the money available after arrival. Children watched the geography change, from familiar plains to desert and mountain country. Parents kept moving toward a destination they usually knew through promises rather than experience. California growers did require large numbers of agricultural workers, but demand was seasonal and uneven. The state did not contain an unlimited supply of stable jobs waiting for every arriving family. Orchards, cotton fields, vegetable farms, and other agricultural operations needed labor at particular stages of planting or harvest. When one crop ended, workers often had to move again. A family that had crossed half a continent hoping to settle could find itself following harvest schedules from county to county. Competition was intense because employers could choose among large numbers of desperate people. Wages remained low when more workers arrived than were needed. Someone unwilling to accept the offered rate might be replaced by another person whose children were hungry. California provided employment for many, but employment did not necessarily provide security. Housing revealed the same contradiction. Migrants lived in tents, cabins, makeshift settlements, roadside camps, or improvised shelters near the fields. Clean water and sanitation could be limited. Heat, mud, insects, and illness added to the difficulty of seasonal work. Privacy was scarce. Families that had once lived on land they considered their own now waited each morning to learn whether someone else would hire them for the day. The social loss could be as severe as the financial one. On the plains, even poor families might have known neighbors, relatives, churches, schools, and businesses for years. Migration broke those connections. Children entered new classrooms and sometimes left again weeks later when work moved elsewhere. Adults who had once planned around their own harvests now organized life around the decisions of growers. Established Californians did not always welcome them. The word Okie became a broad label applied to migrants from the southern and central states, including many who had never lived in Oklahoma. It could carry contempt, reducing families with different histories to a stereotype of poverty, dirt, ignorance, and dependence. Their overloaded vehicles made hardship impossible to hide. They arrived looking exhausted because many were exhausted. Their clothing and possessions revealed what years of economic collapse had taken from them. Although they were American citizens moving within their own country, they could be treated as outsiders. Some local residents feared competition for jobs or pressure on relief systems. Others simply looked down on people whose poverty had become publicly visible. The humiliation could be intense, but migrants were not passive figures waiting for rescue. They adapted because adaptation was necessary. Families exchanged information about employers, wages, and upcoming harvests. Men repaired aging vehicles with whatever parts they could find. Women reorganized domestic life around temporary shelters and uncertain incomes. Camps developed their own routines, social networks, religious gatherings, music, and systems of mutual help. People carried accents, songs, food traditions, and customs from the communities they had left, rebuilding fragments of home in places that initially felt temporary. Federal programs eventually attempted to improve the worst living conditions. Government-run migrant camps provided sanitation, water, basic housing, and greater stability than many roadside settlements. One of the best known was the camp near Arvin, California, later widely remembered as Weed Patch Camp. Life there was still difficult. Residents had to find work outside the camp, wages remained uncertain, and poverty did not disappear because a family had access to clean water. Yet organized facilities could protect people from some of the most dangerous consequences of makeshift living. They also became important places of documentation. Photographers, researchers, writers, and folklorists recorded the lives of migrant workers throughout California. Dorothea Lange's photographs became especially influential because they gave the crisis individual faces. Her camera did not need enormous dust clouds to communicate catastrophe. A tired mother, a temporary shelter, children's clothing, a weathered automobile, or the expression of someone waiting for work could reveal how years of economic and environmental pressure had reshaped ordinary lives. Other researchers recorded songs, speech, interviews, and daily routines, preserving parts of migrant culture that statistics could not capture. Through those records, people far from California encountered individuals rather than an anonymous flow of labor. Literature expanded that awareness further. In 1939, John Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath, following the fictional Joad family from Oklahoma to California. The novel brought national attention to the hardship of displaced agricultural workers and helped turn Route 66 into an enduring symbol of the westward journey. Its influence was so great that later memory sometimes blurred fiction and history. The Joads became representative in popular imagination, but no single family could capture the diversity of the migration. Some people came directly from the Dust Bowl's most severely damaged areas. Others left regions affected more by poverty, mechanization, or declining tenancy than by black storms. Some remained in California permanently. Others returned home or moved again. Many gradually left agricultural labor for towns, construction, manufacturing, or industrial work. The migration changed as the national economy changed. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, expanding defense production on the West Coast opened new opportunities. Shipyards, aircraft factories, military installations, and related industries needed workers. Families who had spent years chasing seasonal harvests could sometimes move into steadier employment. The transformation accelerated after the United States entered the Second World War. People who had once been treated as unwanted migrants became part of the workforce, supporting an industrial boom. Their children entered schools, neighborhoods, and occupations their parents could hardly have imagined when leaving ruined farms. The movement west therefore became more than an escape from drought. It contributed to the growth and social transformation of California and other western states. Yet migration alone did not resolve the question left behind on the Great Plains. Families could leave damaged land, the country could not. Millions of acres still had to produce food. Communities that remained needed an economy. Scientists and conservationists had to determine whether another severe drought would recreate the same disaster. While migrants tried to establish new lives in the West, a slower experiment was underway across the country they had left, testing whether the plains could remain productive without being left so vulnerable to the next dry cycle. The answer emerged gradually from fields rather than speeches. After 1935, the Soil Conservation Service expanded technical assistance, demonstration projects, and research intended to make erosion control part of ordinary agriculture rather than an emergency measure used only after catastrophe. Conservation districts began organizing at the local level, allowing landowners to cooperate with specialists and with one another. The principle mattered because wind ignored property boundaries. One carefully protected farm could still receive soil from a badly exposed neighbor, and the loss from several farms could damage roads, waterways, towns, and entire communities. Managing erosion therefore required both individual action and regional coordination. Across the plains, farmers experimented with techniques that reduced the amount of bare ground exposed to wind. Crop rotations maintained protective vegetation for longer periods. Residue from previous harvests could remain on the surface instead of leaving soil completely uncovered. Contour cultivation and strip cropping interrupted erosion. In the Prairie States Forestry Project, enormous numbers of trees were planted in shelter belts designed to slow wind near agricultural land. None of these measures made the Great Plains immune to drought. They were meant to change what happened when drought returned. The distinction was essential. Americans could not control rainfall, but they could influence whether dry soil remained anchored or entered the atmosphere. By 1937, the formation of soil conservation districts reflected a broader shift in thinking. Land was still private property, but its management had public consequences. The years of black storms had demonstrated that erosion on one farm could become a problem hundreds of miles away. Conservation, therefore, became both a farming practice and an institution. Yet the weather remained the final variable. Drought continued through much of the decade, with conditions improving unevenly from one area to another. There was no single date on which the Dust Bowl ended. The transformation happened gradually as rainfall returned to important areas, vegetation recovered, conservation measures expanded, and fewer acres remained as exposed as they had been at the height of the crisis. The land did not return to its previous condition untouched. Some topsoil was gone permanently. Abandoned farms did not all reopen. Communities had lost population. Families who had rebuilt their lives in California or elsewhere often had little reason to return. Agricultural operations changed, and in some places, larger farms replaced smaller holdings that had failed. What recovered was not the old plains, but a region forced to operate with a new understanding of its limits. The human story changed as well. By the early 1940s, wartime industrial expansion created opportunities that Depression-era migrants could not have predicted. West Coast factories and shipyards absorbed workers who had once depended on seasonal farm labor. More stable wages allowed some families to move from temporary camps into permanent communities. Children who had crossed Route 66 among mattresses and boxes grew into adults whose identities belonged as much to California as to Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, or the other places their parents had left. The migration altered music, politics, labor, language, and culture across the West. It also complicated the idea that the Dust Bowl was simply a disaster from which America recovered when rain returned. The consequences continued through lives and generations long after the sky cleared. The deeper legacy rested in the way the catastrophe changed the country's relationship with soil. Before the 1930s, conservation advocates had already warned that erosion threatened agriculture, but the Dust Bowl gave those warnings a national audience. Americans saw that fertile ground was not guaranteed by ownership, technology, or hard work alone. Productivity could conceal vulnerability during favorable years. A field might generate excellent harvests while losing the protections it would desperately need when rainfall failed. Markets could reward expansion long before the environmental cost became visible. Mechanization could make cultivation more efficient while also allowing mistakes to occur across a much larger area. None of those forces alone caused the catastrophe. Their interaction did. Drought was severe and prolonged. Farmers did not cause the absence of rain, but previous land use helped determine how exposed the soil became when moisture disappeared. Economic weakness intensified the damage because families already carrying debt had little flexibility to change course. Falling agricultural prices reduced income. Repeated crop failures exhausted savings. Erosion damaged future productivity. The Great Depression limited other opportunities. By the time migration began on a large scale, the crisis was no longer environmental or economic in isolation. It had become both at once. That interaction remains one of the reasons the Dust Bowl occupies such a powerful place in American history. It resists the comfort of a simple villain. The farmers who plowed the plains were not ignorant caricatures destroying land for amusement. They were responding to wartime demand, favorable weather, market incentives, government settlement policies, technological change, and the understandable desire to improve their lives. Many of the practices later recognized as dangerous had appeared successful for years. The catastrophe became visible only when conditions changed. That is what makes the story more unsettling than a tale of obvious mistakes. People can make individually rational decisions inside a system that is becoming collectively fragile. The warning lies there, not in blaming a generation that could not see the future perfectly. Photographs from the 1930s remain among the most recognizable images of the Great Depression. Houses almost buried by drifting soil, dark walls crossing open country, children beside migrant camps, families gathered around overloaded vehicles, exhausted parents staring toward uncertain work. Each image captures only a moment, but the real Dust Bowl unfolded through thousands of ordinary choices made over years. Whether to plant again, whether to take another loan, whether to sell the last livestock, whether to stay near relatives or drive west, whether to trust a government conservation specialist, asking a farmer to change methods used for decades, whether to believe that rain would return before money disappeared. Those decisions rarely felt historic to the people making them. They felt immediate. Dinner had to be found. Children needed shelter. A crop had to survive. A bank had to be paid. History emerged from the accumulation of those private pressures. For families who stayed, recovery meant learning to work within a landscape they had once believed could be mastered primarily through effort and machinery. For those who left, recovery meant redefining home. For the federal government, the disaster established conservation as an enduring public responsibility. The Soil Conservation Service eventually evolved into the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but the principle born from the crisis remained recognizable. Productive agriculture depends on protecting the resources that make production possible. Soil is easy to overlook because it appears ordinary. It lies beneath every field and road, silent until something goes wrong. Yet fertile topsoil forms far more slowly than it can be lost. The Dust Bowl forced an industrial nation to confront that imbalance. It showed that prosperity could consume the foundation beneath itself without noticing the danger during good years. That brings the story back to the afternoon of April 14th, 1935. Families looked toward the horizon and watched a black wall advance across the plains. Inside that darkness was more than dirt. It contained fields that had once produced wheat, income that would never be earned, years of labor, mortgages, failed harvests, and part of the future thousands of families had expected to build on the land. The storm became unforgettable because it made an invisible process visible. Soil degradation, economic vulnerability, and years of difficult decisions suddenly appeared as a physical object large enough to cover the sky. The darkness eventually passed. Rain returned. Trees grew along fields. Conservation practices spread. Farms produced again. Migrants built new lives in places their parents had never intended to call home. America emerged from the 1930s, changed by depression, migration, war, and a deeper understanding of the land itself. The Dust Bowl endured in memory because its lesson was not confined to one drought or one generation. Human beings can cultivate a landscape, improve it, profit from it, and build communities upon it, but they cannot cancel the conditions that allow that landscape to survive. The people who watched the plains disappear into the sky learned that truth at enormous cost. Their experience left behind something more durable than the dust. The recognition that civilization may depend on resources so familiar that their value becomes obvious only when they begin to vanish.